Hello, this is Mark Moses. Welcome to the MuniFinanceGuy podcast. Today, I'm going to talk about some of the background behind my book, which is titled The Municipal Financial Crisis, a Framework for Understanding and Fixing Government Budgeting, published by Palgrave Macmillan in January 2022, 4 years ago. So I'm going to cover in the next 15 or 20 minutes my motivation for writing the book, things that were going on at the time, how the writing, editing, and publishing process progressed, and then since the publication of the book, what the reception has been and the kind of things that have changed and not changed in the world of municipal government. And maybe a little bit of a look to the future and some of the issues that I think are continuing to hold cities back. A friend of mine, Jeff Britting, encouraged me to write about some of the things I was seeing in local government. It took a while for that seed to really settle in. And over time, I started to see more clearly that there really was an opportunity to be the first to document what was happening in local government. There was a lot of administrative struggles, financial struggles, operational struggles that cities just never seemed to be able to get their arms around and never seemed to be able to resolve. And I had a perspective on why that was happening, why the conventional solutions were not working, and what needed to be done to break this pattern of resignation to ongoing fiscal crisis and administrative kind of turmoil. I spent 3 decades working directly in local government. Not very many people wrote books, and the people who did tended to write kind of war stories or very narrow perspectives, but nobody was really writing from a broader perspective what was going on, what the problem points were, and what solutions might look like. And I also saw that journalists were struggling to understand when a journalist would be assigned to a city, it would be very difficult for them to get their arms around what was going on. Cities, to a great extent, are impenetrable that way. It's very difficult to figure that out from the outside. And I noticed that new council members, as they would come on, even if they played other roles in other appointments before they went on the city council, by the time they got on the city council, their expectations of what they could do were way out of line with what the reality was. So I thought I could write something that would save people a lot of time, a lot of frustration, bring people up to speed faster on the dynamics that really drive municipal decision making and the cause and effect behind the decisions that are made and the kind of situations and challenges that develop in cities. At the time, I really put my mind to writing the book. I was a finance director for a city in Northern California. I found that I wasn't able to do justice to the writing with the responsibilities of the position. So in 2018, I resigned from the position, although I still consulted to cities and local agencies in order to keep in touch with the current issues that were affecting them. Because it's very difficult, if you cut off completely, it's very difficult to track what's going on in these organizations from the outside. But if you're consulting cities or working in cities, you have a much better tie to what's really going on. So in terms of the writing and the editing and the publishing, a big turning point for me was in March of 2020, because even with the reduced workload from cutting back on the professional work I was doing, I was still struggling to set aside quality time to write. Then in March 2020, when the lockdowns were put in place in California during the pandemic, I was immediately able to pivot and spend the majority of my time on the writing. So the bulk of the writing of this book was done in 2020. I was fortunate enough in the middle of that year to hire an amazing writing coach, Don Watkins, and he really helped me with the whole process of writing, because writing a 200-page book is not like writing 10, 20-page staff reports. And what I was used to was writing staff reports, the kind of things that were disposable, the kind of things that didn't have to be integrated the way a whole book has to be integrated. And so that process gave me a lot of respect for the people who write books and finish writing books and write multiple books. It was a difficult process, challenging, but also very rewarding when I got to the end of it. And then in terms of the publication, that was somewhat of a surreal kind of series of events where I had befriended a journalist who was covering local government. He got to know what I was up to in the writing of my book. He would send me articles he was working on for my comment, because he liked getting my perspective on the things he was writing about. And when he was approached by a major publisher who was searching around to find out who was writing books, who had projects going, he referred me to this publisher, and it turned out to be senior editor and manager at Palgrave Macmillan. Just as I was getting up to speed on the writing, I found myself on a timeline to prepare a proposal to Palgrave Macmillan to be able to have the book published by a major publisher. And that was another somewhat surreal kind of experience, because I'd heard all these horror stories about working with publishers, finding publishers, getting books published. And by the time I got my proposal together, close to the end of 2020, I emailed it to the publisher on a Tuesday. And by Thursday, I received a response saying that they were interested in what I was doing and wanted to move further. So within a couple of months, I had a contract for the ultimate publication of the book with a deadline to provide the manuscript by the middle of 2021. And that was an incredible experience, because it really raised my ability to put the book out on a larger platform than simply a self-published type book. And I hadn't really had time to think much about the publishing before that, because I was so focused on the writing. So the book was published in January of 2022. And since then, I've found some interesting things in terms of kind of things that fit my picture and things that haven't fit my picture of the way things would roll out. First, I really thought my book would get traction with journalists who were covering local government. And I thought that what I was providing in the book was something that would help them understand the cities that they're covering, would give them a higher range of things they could write about in terms of the perspective it would give them. But that part's been disappointing, because what I found is not very many journalists have the time to really learn what's going on in their cities. They're given the assignment of writing about the cities, but not a lot of time to figure things out. And what I suspect is the better of these journalists who are assigned to cities move out and up into other levels of government type policy coverage. And there's not a whole lot of effort being put into supporting good journalism at the local level. I've had a few journalists call me and reach out to me who are trying to understand their cities, but I was hoping for more traction in that area. The feedback I have gotten and the relationships I have developed have been positive, but I was hoping for more national type traction. My main marketing challenge is that the people and organizations potentially most receptive to what I have to offer are not really looking for or expecting a book like mine. Again, there's not a real genre for this type of writing, because not very many people write about local government. Certainly not very many people write about it from a broader philosophic perspective. It's been pretty much 20 years since anything's been attempted in this area. And that, from my point of view, was more of an attempt to preserve the status quo and not really think holistically and radically about what needs to be done in local government. So much of my marketing has been oriented towards making people aware of my work. Where I've gotten in front of people, when I've been able to address audiences, the reception has been very positive. Because there's no real genre, there's no one else really doing what I'm doing. No one's looking for it. So it would be great if there was 5 other people doing what I was doing, because then at least people would have a way to frame and categorize what I'm doing. But I'm having to do all that type of work as part of my introduction to people. As I look back over the last 4 years, I think about, okay, if I were to write this book now, what would change? What if there was going to be a revision of the book or a rewrite of the book? How would it be different? And I think the bottom line there is I've learned, mainly through the interactions and through giving talks related to the book and doing follow-up type essays, I think I've refined my writing and some of my formulations, and I've tightened those types of things up. And I'm sure I could write a book that maybe flowed better and maybe was expanded a little bit with additional examples that might be helpful to people. But the object of my writing, the state of municipal finance and municipal organizations, has not really changed. It's the things that I criticize as conventional solutions that are ineffective are still out there, still being attempted. The narrative really has not changed in the way they characterize the situations they're in as inevitable, as in intractable. And the only solutions I see out there to every financial problem is a new tax, a new way of charging individuals and businesses for things that they had not been charged for in the past, all to keep the organization afloat, not ongoing, not like it solves a structural problem going forward, but just another Band-Aid to make it through another couple years before another tax needs to be added. And one of the things I talk about in the book is the problem isn't that taxes are too high, it's that under the structure these organizations operate, they'll always have to go higher. And so that's playing out just as I talked about in the book. What I would really like to see is somebody seriously attempt to apply the principles that I put forth in the book. And I'm a bit skeptical, and I've hesitated to really push to get into an organization to sell them on at least trying the principles that I establish, because I'm afraid that most organizations would look at it as just another step to go through the motions of doing, so that they could say, see, we tried that didn't work, now we need another parcel tax or another sales tax increase. But I'd really like to see somebody seriously embrace the principles and give it a try, so that we can get some good cities or organizations to point to as far as, look, when you do this, you can get your organization under control. And then the reason I'm a bit pessimistic about all this is, and why I think it'll be a slow process, is there's tremendous political entrenchment. You don't get to be a council member in very many cities in the United States without support from the public sector unions. And so it's very difficult to push back on the status quo way of doing city work. People basically don't get elected or don't stay in there long if they go against what the public sector unions want to see. And that's a big problem as far as implementing change. And even before that, organizations in their labor agreements have bargained away what you would normally consider management's rights in terms of how the work gets scheduled, how the work gets done, how job descriptions are established. And it's taken, this has occurred over multiple decades. It would definitely take time to unravel that. And then another element that is a bit of a barrier is there's become a lot of general hostility to private action, whether it be for profit or charitable. And there's a general sentiment that out there where they'd rather accept a mediocre result from a municipality, whether it be their homeless program or their sewer utility, than they would see a private company take over those areas or a private charity take over those areas. So I think that suspicion to private action and private interested action is a big barrier, and one that I'm working on trying to position that no, this is really the solution. We've been keeping private action, private innovation on the sidelines here in favor of a bureaucracy that was set up to protect rights and legislate, but it's taken over these commercial and charitable activities. And that's really the source of why the government can't even do a good job of its core function of protecting rights, because it's involved in all these other activities that have been laid on top. And many of the people who are convinced that there's a problem have not really learned to be effective. They don't have a good understanding of how all this came about, and therefore they don't have a good understanding of how to go about renovating and reforming local government. And that's something that in my work, as I continue on, write more articles and get the word out, I'm trying to help them with.